So if you are trying to train for a thru hike, this episode is for you. Now, in this episode, we go deep around my system of training hikers for their thru hiking adventures. And we go into quite a lot of detail, and it is quite a long episode around all the different areas that a thru hiker should consider in their preparations, common mistakes I see from thru hikers, and we go into a lot of detail around how I use training and preparation to get thru hikers in the best physical and mental position for their adventures. So if you're training for a thru hike, or you're considering a thru hike, or you're just curious about how we may go about preparing for someone for a massive adventure like this episode is going to be gold. So enough from me, let's get into it. Hey, my name is Rowan Smith, and I want to welcome you to the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, this is the world's very first podcast which is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare, and conquer your upcoming hike, trek, or mountain adventure. So once a week, I'm going to be giving you quality and practical information on the subjects of physical preparation for trekking, dealing with altitude, and nutrition on the trail, so you can know everything you need to be doing to have the best chance of a safe, enjoyable, and successful adventure. So now you know what you're in for. Let's get into today's episode. Okay, hello guys. Today we are talking all about how you can train for your first thru hike, or if it's not your first thru hike, your first extended long trek. Now, the reason why I want to talk about this today is that it is a question that does come up a lot, because a thru hike in the hiking community is often something that a lot of us aspire to. Whether it's like the Pacific Crest Trail, or maybe it's Te Araroa, which I always butcher the pronunciation of. Maybe it's the Larapinta Trail, or whatever it might be. But a lot of us as hikers have these thru hikes on our bucket list somewhere, and it's something that we do aspire to one day. And then for a lot of us, eventually, that aspiration, that dream, actually does become a possibility. Maybe you've got a couple of years of hiking under your belt. Maybe you've got the opportunity, some time off work, or whatever it might be, and it becomes a serious possibility. But the whole idea of preparing yourself to hike for weeks or even months at a time, again and again on the trail, going through completely different terrain and all these different things, it can be really, really overwhelming. Because getting through a day hike, an overnight hike, maybe even a week-long trek or something like that, that sounds pretty doable for a lot of people. But for something this major, it can be pretty stressful. So today we're going to be going into deep on this subject to really give you some clarity around this subject and give a really nice framework for anyone who is thinking about stepping up for their first thru hike. Now, for long-time listeners, a lot of this information, it may be things you've already heard in the podcast here and there. And essentially, I'm taking a lot of bits and pieces I've used in previous episodes and really bring it into one comprehensive episode. For any new listeners who might be new to the podcast and just landed on this is going to be talking you through a really thorough process and how to get you ready. And there's going to be a lot of subjects which you can go in a lot more detail in either other subjects on the podcast, or the other episodes on the podcast, and get into the nitty-gritty of certain details, or you can find information in the Training for Hiking and Trekking Facebook group, which is attached to this episode. So with that being said, I think it is about time to get into it. Now, first and foremost is, as we said, the thru hike does come with some particular demands you need to get ready for. The pure fact of just doing day after day after day, week after week, even month after month on the trail, it's huge in itself. But then you got to think about rough and even uneven terrain, all elevation changes, carrying a full pack and living out of that. You got river crossings, altitude, different climates you might have been going through, and obviously all your logistics and gear. But we're not going to be touching on that today. But it's such a massive thing, and not only that. But not only do you really want to survive these issues and actually get to the end point of this thru hike and not break down with, pain, injury, or exhaustion, which is so common for thru hikers, but you also want to be in a position where you can actually enjoy yourself. Because if you're dedicating weeks or months of your life to this type of thing, you don't want to be hating every step of the way. And if you're in that situation, there's no way you're going to get to the end unless you're really determined. But either way, it's just not something you want to be in a position like. So it can be really, really understandable if all of this, looking at it from the outside or from the beginnings, it can seem a bit much. And then to make it even worse, as I say quite a bit on this podcast, a lot of the training information out there online for thru-hikers specifically is just really, really, really poor. You go into things like Backpacker Magazine, or you go into things like Outside Online, and like the stuff they're talking about, it's not good. It sort of gives you a little bite-sized chunk of information, but doesn't really help you. And it gives you this stuff that's, in all honesty, it's not incredibly good. And it can be really, really stressful trying to piece it all together and figure out what you want to do. So essentially the intention of this podcast today is to really give you a clear and effective guideline on how a thru-hiker can really best prepare themselves for an upcoming adventure. So you can be really confident that you are doing the right things to ensure a safe, enjoyable, and successful thru-hike, whatever that may be. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of it all, there are a few important points that we want to talk about as an overview when it comes to this type of preparation. Now, first and foremost is you need to keep this at the top of your mind, is injury is a thru-hiker's absolute worst energy. Now, one thing you want to avoid at all costs in both your preparation and your time on the trail is pain and injury. But unfortunately, these things are so common for thru-hikers, whether it's in their preparation or whether it's in their actual time on the trail. And it is one of the most common reasons why many thru-hikers never end up succeeding on their big adventures. Now, things like knee pain, plantar fasciitis, shin splints, back pain, shoulder pain, all these different things are all incredibly common for thru-hikers. And in your preparations, a large emphasis really should be put on building up resilience to prevent these things. Because while it may be possible to jump out on the trail and develop your trail legs into trail fitness once you start hiking, in my opinion, that's not ideal, but it is possible, you will not be able to develop the stability and the resilience you need to prevent pain and injury while you're actually on the trail. It's just not gonna happen. And you really are playing, Russian roulette there. So when it comes to preparation, this is what is going to count for your pain and injury prevention. Doing the right things before you hit the trail to give you the best chance possible. And this reason in itself should give you all the motivation you need to take your training seriously. Now, the next important point, and something that most thru-hikers do need to hear, is in all honesty, in your preparations, you should probably forget about replicating the numbers. Now, what I mean by that is one common concern I hear from so many thru-hikers out there is, and it can be really, really overwhelming and, even anxiety producing, when you're looking at this, is thinking, how are you going to get yourself ready to hike day after day after day after day? And how are you going to do that in your preparations? Because you have a job, you might have a family, you got friends, you got a social life, you've got other things in your life that you want to be doing. And there's really no way you can actually fit all of that into your training and actually get yourself ready to hike for week after week, in your preparations. And in all honesty, the truth is you're never going to be able to replicate these numbers in your training. Being able to replicate, hiking for weeks on end, that's your actual hike. It's not going to happen in your training. It's just not possible. And in all honesty, it genuinely isn't worth stressing about. Now, what you can do, and what we're going to be talking about further in this podcast, is you can overload the body in specific ways with your training. So you can build up strength, endurance, cardiovascular capacity, resilience to help you in these situations on the trail. And you're going to build up more strength, endurance, cardiovascular capacity, and resilience than you would typically need for a standard hike. So while you can't exactly replicate the hiking numbers you are expecting, you can prepare your body for that. And that's an incredibly important point to consider. Now, the next point I want to make is take the slow and steady approach. And, this should be common sense, but it does need to be said because we always say common sense just ain't common. To best prepare for a thru-hike, you should be dedicating consecutive months of consistent training. And as a minimum, I recommend aiming for at least 3 months. More is better if you can. Don't leave this until the last minute and just keep on delaying and keep on ignoring it. It is much better to give yourself plenty of time because things will always come up. You might get sick. You might have to go away. You might have crazy times at work. You might have, a tragedy happen or a dozen other things might come up. Save yourself the stress save yourself the anxiety, and save yourself this risk of not being able to fit in the prep you need. Start early and then slowly ramp things up from there. And the final thing I want to say before we get into it all is don't listen to the naysayers. Now, what I mean by that is anyone preparing for a through hike, you might be going into forums or Facebook groups or whatever and researching this, and you'll likely hear stories of people, who've succeeded on this adventure without a minute of dedicated training. Hell, it's really hard to enter a through hiking community without seeing someone bragging about this approach. And they're like, oh, don't worry about training. Just hit the trail and, you'll be fine. Or they'll be like, oh, I didn't do a day's worth of training and I hiked the whole PCT or whatever it is. But in all honesty, when it comes down to it, they were lucky and they are in the minority. For every person you hear bragging about not having done any preparation or any training, there are probably dozens of hikers who have failed because they were underprepared. But the fact is you just don't hear anything from them because it's not something they're shouting from the rooftops and it's not something that's in your face all the time. So please, don't take the risk. Do the hard work before you go. Give yourself a fighting chance and just try your best to ignore any naysayers you might come across. Now, with that all being said, now it's time to talk about what you want to be doing in your preparations and your training. And when you're training for a through hike, my personal opinion, I talk about this all the time in this podcast, is really taking a balanced and comprehensive approach. So not just focusing on one area, not just doing hiking, not just doing walking or whatever it may be, but really taking a comprehensive approach. Because there are so many things you need to prepare for. There's elevation gain and loss, rough terrain, long distances, injury pain prevention, pack carrying, all that stuff I was talking about before. And in all honesty, if you're not covering all your bases, you're leaving yourself open to many things that could go wrong. And our idea in the training is we want to minimize the risk of all these things as much as we can. So with that in mind, I recommend aspiring through hikers incorporate the following things in their preparation: hiking, strength training, hiking specific conditioning, mobility, and as an added extra, optional extra, I should say, is extra low intensity cardio. So the hiking training, let's start there. Now, when you're preparing for a hike, through hike, I should say, getting out and hiking is always going to be a cornerstone of preparation. Because simply put, there's never going to be anything else that can reasonably simulate, the uneven, undulating, and just unpredictable nature of the trail. So there does have to be some element of hike training in your preparations. Now, if you don't live right next to a trail, you might not be able to get out every week or every couple of weeks, but you got to fit in what you can. You got to see what's realistic for you. Now, a common trap many hikers fall into is just doing a series of random hikes in their preparation. Now, while that can work, it's not optimal and it's not efficient. And, when we're talking about this on this podcast, we want to be doing the right things to get the best benefits out of the least amount of time. And if you do these things wrong and you don't think about this hike training, the hike, it can leave you open to overuse injuries like plantar fasciitis, hiker's knee, shin splints. I hear this all the time. So you don't want to be leaving yourself open for that. And on the other end of things, if you're not, structuring out your hike training well enough, or you're not doing your hikes in a certain order, you can significantly undershoot the fitness you need to tackle your adventure best. And you might not be getting to the distances or the difficulties you need to really be prepared for your actual hike. So when it comes to your hike training, a little bit of planning and a little bit of structure can go an incredibly long way. So when planning out your hike training, there are a few questions you need to answer yourself. Number one, how often can you realistically get out on the trail each month? That's not how often you want to get out, but how much you realistically can. Number two, how long is your longest day on the trail and what elevation gain or loss will you be dealing with? And number three, what is the heaviest your pack is expected to be on any days on the trail? Now, once you answer that question, the planning begins. First and foremost, get out a calendar. This is exactly what you need, best piece of training kit in this situation. You essentially want to schedule in your start date, the day you're actually leaving on your hike. 2 weeks before your start date, on whatever weekend that lands on, or whatever day you have available, you want to schedule in a day hike, or even an overnighter if you can, which is equivalent to the longest day you expect on the trail, as close to the elevation as possible, and with the equivalent of your heaviest pack weight. So I'll say that again. equivalent to the longest day on the trail, as close to the elevation gain loss as possible, and with the equivalent of the heaviest pack weight you're expecting on the trail for a day hike. Now, if you're expecting to be hiking at high altitude, if you have the opportunity to get up at high altitude for this hike, that's always a good thing as well. But, it's not super practical for a lot of people. Now, the intention behind this is even though you're not getting out for day after day after day after day of hiking in this situation, if you can do the longest day with the same amount of pack weight, the same amount of elevation, that is going to be a hard day. And that's going to be the peak of your training. And that's going to be the hardest hike you do in all of your training. And this is the perfect time to do it 2 weeks out. Now, once that's penciled into your calendar, and you can figure out all the details later, but you're going to work backwards in your calendar and basically jot down all the dates you expect you'll be able to hike, based on whatever you said in the question 1 above of how often do you realistically think you can hike. So you're going to work yourself back, just pencil in all these dates. And then essentially from there, you're going to jot in some distances and some pack weights and some elevation. And you'll figure out that in a slow and steady build up over the months. Now, if you've given yourself enough time, which hopefully you have, you should be able to do your first training hikes relatively comfortably. So they shouldn't be too outrageously strenuous. They shouldn't be pushing to the limit, but you should get through them and be like, you know what, that was good. I could probably go a little bit more. And then hike by hike, you slowly increase those metrics, whether it's your distance, your pack weight, or your elevation, or a combination of those. And then you're going to hit those ultimate targets 2 weeks out from your start date. And it will take a little bit of fiddling around. It's not set in stone, but it's good to get this planned out. Now, the system isn't perfect. I'll tell you that. It definitely isn't perfect, but it's good enough. And because there are going to be likely things that do come up during this time. You're probably going to get sick and miss a hike. You might do a hike with a friend or a family member who wants to come along and they might not be confident doing such a distance, or they might be quicker and you might not want to carry around a heavy pack or whatever it might be. Or you might end up doing more hiking than you planned. This is all to be expected and that's absolutely fine. But as long as you have a rough framework in front of you, you can adapt and change things as necessary. And this really, really does go an incredibly long way. And I cannot stress how important this can be. So that's first and foremost how to figure out your hiking training. Now, the second incorporation into your training is your strength training. Now, as I always say, strength training is amazing for hikers. And while it's often overlooked, strength training can really be a thru-hiker's best friend in their preparation. Now, it is absolutely incredible at reducing your risk of pain and injury, both in your training and on the trail, improving your movement efficiency on the trail, so every step you take does use less energy, making elevation gain and loss much easier and much more comfortable, improving your confidence over unstable and tricky terrain, and making a heavy pack much more comfortable. So it's safe to say incorporating some strength training into your preparations can be hugely beneficial. So how do you go about this? Well, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty today because I've done so many podcasts talking around different strength workouts, different strength exercises, different approaches already on those subjects. So if you were interested in getting to the nitty-gritty, you can either check out the other episodes or you can get involved in the Training for Hiking and Trekking, a Facebook group where I do share a lot of information around the subject as well. But what I am going to talk about is just give you some general do's and don'ts which are worth considering when it comes to your strength training for your thru-hiking. So hopefully this will get you started on the right track. Now, first of all, don't just do squats, lunges, and step-ups and think that's your strength training. Now, squats, lunges, and step-ups are some of the most popular exercises for hikers. They're recommended everywhere, and, most hikers have done them at some stage. And, absolutely, they are absolutely amazing, and they can be incredibly beneficial for a hiker's training. However, if this is all you're doing, this is honestly a mistake. And cannot be considered, structured strength training. Because these exercises all do train similar muscles. And while they're training, and while these muscles, are essential for hiking, and these pushing muscles are essential for hiking, you do have other things going on in the body. So what you should be doing, as opposed to just doing your squats, lunges, and step-ups, is you should be training the body in balance. Now, the body is a complex mechanism, and it's crazy to think that only certain muscles are going to be used when you're hiking and not using others. As much as you might feel some working more than the others, everything is contributing in its own way. So the best practice is to train your body in balance so you're covering all your bases. Now, an easy rule to figure this out, and you don't really need to know too much about training to figure this out, is essentially for every lower body exercise or upper body exercise you do, which you're doing a pushing motion. So you're pushing into the ground and you're working sort of the front of the legs. So things like squats, lunges, and step ups. You should do an opposing pulling exercise. So this can be things like deadlifts or single leg deadlifts or glute bridges or good mornings or something like that. Literally going one for one, balancing those two things out. Easy enough to do, and that will make sure you're hitting the balance in your training. Now, the next thing that you shouldn't be doing, so you should try to be avoiding in your training, is just focusing on high repetition strength training. Now, hikers commonly really like to train high repetition strength training. And the typical thought process really goes, look, if I do high repetitions and I really chase that sort of muscle burn, I can improve my leg endurance for the trail. So when I'm going up and down hills, when the legs are getting burny, this high repetition training will help with that, which is absolutely true. And high repetition training can be really beneficial for any hiker in any preparation. However, if this is all you're doing in your training, in all honesty, you're incredibly selling yourself short. Now, when you are doing your strength training, I highly recommend that a thru-hiker trains both lower and higher repetition training. So exercises with a little bit extra resistance, a little extra challenge, and some that don't have so much challenge, but you do more and more repetitions. Now, the reason behind this is that lower repetition strength training is probably the best stuff you can be doing to help with the pain and injury prevention, to help with the movement efficiency that we talked about earlier, and also help make that elevation hiking much more comfortable. And if you're only doing high repetition strength training, you may get some benefits in those areas, but really you are missing out big time. So to get the best benefits actually on the trail, a hiker should really try to train a mix of lower repetition strength training, so around about 8 repetitions or lower, and high repetition training, so 12, 15 plus. And this is something that every single hiker should look to too. Now, obviously, this can be a bit intimidating for some people when they're first getting into their strength training. And I'm not telling you have to dive into heavy squats or heavy deadlifts or anything like that. But if you've been doing a particular exercise for a while, whether it's a lunge or a step up or whatever it may be, maybe week by week, add a little extra weight and slowly reduce those repetitions down and slowly challenge yourself a little bit more. And it really will pay off. Now, one thing to really be aware of here, and I want to make this incredibly clear, is this type of strength training is not going to automatically put on extra muscle onto your frame. And I see this always online from hikers, and there will always be someone who pops in saying, all right, be careful of strength training because you don't want to be lugging around extra muscle on the trail, or, that type of training will make we put on all this extra weight. And it's just not true. It doesn't happen. It's not going to be a consequence of this type of training unless you're doing a whole bunch of other things. To put on extra muscle, it does take a lot of effort. So you have to be doing lots and lots of training, lots and lots of particular strength training. You really have to be eating a lot more food than you need. And it is a process. But for a typical hiker who might just be doing a little bit of strength training their week and might just be dipping their toes in this lower repetition stuff, and they're not eating to excess and they're controlling that, it's not going to put on extra muscle. You can get incredibly strong, both for your training and for the trail, without actually putting on a single kilo of extra muscle. And I've done another podcast on that subject, which goes into quite a bit of detail, but it is not something a hiker needs to be worried about. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is what a thru-hiker should avoid when it comes to their strength training, is just doing random exercises, when they feel like it, whether it's at the gym, whether it's home. And it's something that I see people do all the time, and they'll just turn up to the gym and they'll say, okay, today I did a bit of leg press, I did a bit of chest press, I did this, I did that. Or they're at home and they're like, I did some squats, I did some step ups, I did a few clams. And yeah, this can get you up to a point. It's better than nothing. But in all honesty, just doing random exercises day to day, it's never going to be a great way of going about things. It's not an effective way of training, and you're only really going to see minimal results for your time on the trail. And into this, I also do include the typical HIIT training and typical circuit classes that you find online in gyms, and they're really popular right now. Now, these classes, unfortunately, most of them are just a mishmash, losing my words, of Exercises, there's no thought behind them, there's no structure, there's no consistency. And yes, these can be great for sort of general fitness and weight loss if that's what you're training for. But if you're a hiker and you're training for a particular outcome, so you're training to get strong, to help reduce injury and improve your performance when you're actually on the trail, it's not a very effective way of going about things. So HIIT training, circuit classes, even CrossFit, I don't recommend on this front. What I do recommend, however, is following a structured plan and a structured strength training plan. And this is the single best thing a thru-hiker can use for their strength development and to help them on the trail. And typically, these would be created by a professional who knows what they're doing and it's not just a random selection of exercises. Now, this will ensure you're getting the nice mix of consistency, progression, and specificity that you need to see the best results on the trail. And it does take a bit of thought behind this. So investing in a plan or talking to a professional, it's worth its weight in gold when it comes down to this. The next thing that I'd highly recommend thru-hikers avoid is training like a bodybuilder. Now, the old school approach to strength training, which everyone still does, so many people in the gym and so many trainers are still teaching, goes a bit like this. You do an exercise for one particular exercise. You do 10, 12, 15 repetitions. You rest for anywhere from a minute to 2 minutes. You do that exercise again. You rest. Do the exercise again, and then you get on to another exercise that targets a different muscle, and you do exactly the same thing. And then you work around the gym or work around the home, and you do exercise after exercise after exercise until you sort of work through the whole body or whatever you may be doing. Now, this type of training, absolutely, it can work really, really, really well for bodybuilders. And for those who have lots and lots and lots of time to spend with their training, and they really enjoy this, they use the gym or their training as a social thing, and it's something they're happy to spend a lot of time in. But for a hiker, in all honesty, this is not a good use of your time, and I do not recommend it at all. Instead, please, I strongly urge you use your time effectively. So don't do this bodybuilding approach. But instead, what you want to do is string together a number of exercises in which you're sort of filling up the rest periods between your main exercises, so your leg exercises, or when you may just be sitting around for a minute, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, but fill this up with other exercises that aren't targeting the legs, but are still going to be beneficial for you. So you can fill this up with things like upper body exercises, with core training or mobility work. So an example like this, you might be doing a squat. That might be your main exercise you're trying to improve on. So you do your squats, you do 10 repetitions of that, and then instead of sitting around playing on your phone doing nothing, you'd go straight into some push-ups, and then you go straight into a side plank, and then you go straight into a calf stretch. And then by the time you finish all of those, the legs will have had plenty of rest, and they'll be fresh enough to go again. So you go back to the top, then you go squat, push-up, side plank, calf stretch. Do that 3 or 4 times. You've just fit a huge amount of work into a small amount of time. And not only is this going to give the legs the optimal rest they need to recover in between sets, because the muscles do need a reasonable amount of time between sets to really develop their strength, but it also manages to fit in so much extra productive work. And so over the long term, you can fit in so much, even if you're only doing 20-minute sessions, 30-minute sessions, 40-minute sessions. But following structure like this, so much better than training like a bodybuilder. And then the final thing I want to talk about on this front in regards to the strength training is please don't do things which cause you pain. And when it comes down to this, strength training really shouldn't leave you in pain. Yes, it might be uncomfortable in regards to muscle soreness and muscle burn, but it shouldn't be painful. And it's something you don't need to push through. But I see people all the time in gyms. They'll finish an exercise and they're like, oh, my shoulder didn't like that. Or they'll finish an exercise like, oh, my knee's a bit sore. But they'll just do it again and again and again. It's crazy. Please do not push through exercises which cause you pain. Instead, choose exercises which are right for you as an individual. If an exercise causes you pain, find another alternative that's more comfortable. In all honesty, for every single exercise you may do at home or in the gym or whatever it may be, there's probably a dozen, if not 24 different exercises which you'll do get exactly the same outcome, but maybe more comfortable for you. So when it comes down to this, it might involve choosing another exercise. It might involve taking the exercise you're doing and just doing, a reduced range of motion. So instead of going so deep on your squats, maybe putting a box underneath you, or just doing sort of another exercise completely. Whatever it may be, find exercises that work for you. And again, if you're not sure how this happens and not sure how to figure this out, talk to a professional, because that's what they're there for. So hopefully that's given you a bit of insight into some things to focus on and some things to avoid when it comes to your strength training for your through hiking. Obviously, this is a massive, massive, massive subject. There's so much detail that goes into this, but it is something that is important, and hopefully you got a bit of insight around this. Now, before we go any further, if you did have any questions of this particular subject, if you're curious about learning a bit more about strength training for your through hiking, if you want some exercise demonstrations, if you want some ideas, you want some help changing things around, or whatever it may be, a really good resource for you is going to be the Training for Hiking and Trekking Facebook group. Now, inside that Facebook group, it's a free community inside where I put up a whole bunch of extra information around training for these adventures. And if you do have questions, I'm always happy to answer them. If you need ideas, I'm always happy to do videos or whatever it may be. So you can find it at the Training for Hiking and Trekking Facebook group. I'll leave a link in the show notes below if you do need help. Now, moving on, the next area of a through hiker's preparation that I highly, highly, highly recommend you get around is hiking specific conditioning. Now, this is what I call, it's basically a fancy way of saying cardiovascular training sessions, so cardio sessions, which target a very particular aspect of fitness which is relevant for hiking. So it's not just doing a random run, it's not just doing a random jog or doing a class or whatever it may be. But the key word here is it's very specific, very particular. So it's not just the generic training that people will use to lose weight and tone up, because you can do absolutely anything for those outcomes and get where you need to be. But these sessions are going to directly help you on the trail in your adventures. So a few great examples of this and things that I really, really do enjoy, and I typically program for a lot of my through hikers, involve things like loaded pack walking. So it's literally just going around a local neighborhood, a local park, on a treadmill or a short local trail, and just walking around with your pack and slowly week by week getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And you may only be doing 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 60 minutes, but you get heavier and heavier and heavier with that pack. And it can be a fantastic addition to any type of hiking you're doing. Or it might be stair or hill intervals where you find a set of stairs or hills, or you're in the Stairmaster on the treadmill in the gym and you're going up and down a number of times. Or it might involve hiking specific interval training. So not just random HIIT training, not just random sprint training, but intervals that are very, very particular for certain elements of hiking fitness, which I've talked about loads on this podcast before. And you can dive into a whole bunch of different episodes around that, which we talk about it, or come check it out in the Training for Hiking and Trekking Facebook group. I can give you some direction there. Or it might be tempo walking, where you're doing fast, slow walking intervals just around your local neighborhood. Or it might be training with a sled, which is absolutely fantastic piece of equipment for any hiker, and it's often underutilized. As you can see, each of these sessions, they're pretty obvious that they're directly going to help you on the trail. And it's something that I think every hiker should be doing. So when it comes down to this, how would you use this in your training? Typically, I recommend choosing one or two of these sessions to do each week, depending on how much time you have available, depending on what your preferences are, and yada yada. Now, what I'd say is repeat the same session for 4 to 8 weeks. Each time you're doing it, increasing the difficulty in some way. So if you're doing loaded pack walking, you might add an extra kilo to your pack each week. Simple as that. Or if you're doing intervals on the stairs, you might just add an extra set of stairs, or you might add a little bit of pack weight, or whatever it may be. Really, really simple, but just making sure each time you do it, there's a little bit of extra challenge. Then after the end of the 4 to 8 weeks, depending on what you prefer and depending on how often you personally feel like you need to change your exercise before you get bored, change to another type of session and just repeat the same process. Now, these sessions, they don't have to be super, super long. And I would usually say sticking these to, anywhere from 20 to 60 minutes. So these should fit into your week pretty simply, and they shouldn't cause a huge amount of stress to your schedule. But they can be very, very, very effective if used correctly and consistently. And it's something I think every through hiker should be using because they're so, so beneficial. Now, the next facet of training I want to talk about for through hikers is mobility training for through hikers. Now, many hikers may not first consider this, and they may not first consider mobility or flexibility as something that should be part of their training. And they might do a stretch here and there, but it's not really that much focus. But in all honesty, this can be a really, really important part of any through hiker's preparation and training, and purely for the fact that if certain muscles are restricted and they don't have a huge range of motion, they might be a bit tight for whatever reason, this can often increase the risk of certain discomforts, certain pains, and even give you increased injury risk, or potentially just impact your ability to move comfortably and effectively on the trail. Now, for some common examples here is, if your ankles or your hips, if they're tight, if they're restricted, they don't have the range of motion they want, this can be a really, really easy risk factor or common risk factor for knee pain and hiker's knee, and particularly when you're going downhill. Because if the body is restricted and the body can't find the movement it wants in the ankles or the hips, it'll allow more movement through the knee, which is typically not a good thing, and this can lead to pain and discomfort. Really, really common thing. Or if your hips or your mid to upper back is restricted, which gets very, very common with our culture of sitting down in the office chairs and all of that, this can be a risk factor when it comes to lower back pain. And if you're carrying a heavy pack, this is super, super, super relevant. Or if your hips are restricted, and you just simply can't lift your knees up very high, this can really make rock hopping or higher steps much, much harder than it needs to be. Now, some people might be listening to this like, yeah, I've got no issues with mobility, whatever it may be. But if you are a little bit tight, you're probably aware of it. And hopefully this is a bit of a wake-up call and saying, okay, this is something you might want to work on. Now, there are just so many areas of potential impacts mobility can have for a thru-hiker on the trail. And there's so many different areas. I'm not going to ramble on about it. But what we want to talk about is how can you actually improve your mobility when it comes down to this. Now, there are a few things that typically can help, which I generally include in most of my thru-hikers programs. And the three things that I talk about are self-myofascial release, static stretching, and mobility exercises or dynamic stretching. Now, self-myofascial release is pretty much just self-massage. And you might be using a foam roller, a massage ball, a water bottle, a trekking pole, or even your fingers, just to help sort of release, in quotation marks, the muscles and help them loosen off, help them feel a little bit nicer, help them take a bit of tension out. Now, this type of stuff, it's really, really good at improving short-term range of motion. Meaning you'll do it for a minute or two, you'll stand up, you're like, oh yeah, I'm feeling free, I'm feeling loose, I'm feeling really, really good. But typically it isn't super good at long term, in the sense that if this is all you're doing, you'll constantly be going back to it and sort of getting that short-term benefit. Next day you go back and it'll be pretty much the same. And you're just constantly doing it. So what I highly recommend is making sure if you are doing this, which I fully encourage, making sure you are combining it with typical stretches or mobility exercises, that I'm going to recommend below. Now, with self-myofascial release, you can really work on any body part. You might do the calves, you might do the quads, you might do the glutes, hamstrings, whatever it may be. If you want some ideas around this and how to help and some exercises, again, find me in the Training for Hiking and Trekking Facebook group and I'll help you out. Now, the next area of mobility work is static stretching. And this is probably the stretching that most hikers are aware of. And you've probably done this since your high school gym classes. And this is just a traditional stretch exercise where you basically just hold a position where you're stretching and just hold that for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, or whatever it may be. And you just sort of really feel it relax and release. Now, when it comes down to this, the simple key to this type of stretching, doesn't matter where you're stretching, but it's just making sure you hold your stretches for at least 60 seconds if you are trying to improve your mobility. Now, if you're holding a stretch for 10, 15, 20 seconds, yeah, it can feel good and it can help relax you and help, take a bit of stress or whatever it may be. But if you're actually trying to improve your mobility over the long term, probably try to aim for 60 seconds or more. And then the final area of sort of mobility, when it comes down to it, is what I call mobility exercises, also known as dynamic stretches. And these are similar to stretches, but instead of holding a particular endpoint and just holding that stretch, what you're sort of doing is moving in and out of the stretch. So you're going back and forth, and turning into a bit more of an active motion. Now, a classic example of this might be a leg swing, in which you're sort of holding a fence, and you sort of kick your leg up, feel a bit of stretch into your hamstring with a straight leg, then kick your leg back, then up and back and up and back. And yeah, it's just a really nice addition there. Now, typically a few good times to include any type of mobility training. So whether it's the self-myofascial release, whether it's the static stretching, whether it's dynamic stretching, is including in your warm-ups before your training or before you're hiking, really, really good. In your rest periods during your strength training, as I was talking about before, in standalone sessions on your off days from training. So if you have finished this, got a day off and you're feeling a bit sore or whatever, this can be a really good way just to relieve a little bit of discomfort and achiness and just help you recover a bit more. And in your empty time during the day. So, if you're just hanging around, brushing your teeth or waiting for the kettle to boil or waiting for the bus or waiting for no one's getting faxes anymore. I've almost said that, but whatever it may be, just in empty times in your day. Because when it comes down to this, mobility is generally, it responds to volume and it just needs lots and lots and lots of stretching to really make a difference over the long term. So that's something most thru hikers, I think, should consider. And then the final facet of all of this, when it comes down to the training side of things, is just general cardio. Now, what I mean about that is just, we talked about hiking training, we talked about hiking specific conditioning. Basically, on top of all of that, any type of lower intensity, long duration cardiovascular training is always going to be beneficial. So things like cycling and walking and swimming and going on the elliptical or the rower or the gym, even running if you like running, these can all be super, super beneficial, and just doing extra on this can be good. Now, typically with this type of thing, as a thru hiker, you want to keep your intensity low. So you don't have to be going out absolutely flogging yourself. You don't have to be completely sweating messes. You don't have to be redlining your heart rate or anything might be. You want to keep things low and slow and long. So this is important because it's going to be making sure you do target a particular energy system, which is super relevant for hiking, which is your aerobic energy system. If you go too quick, you tend to target other areas of your fitness, which can be beneficial to certain degrees. But when it comes to hiking, this aerobic fitness is the single most important thing. So you want to be keeping this slow and easy. Now, an easy, really easy way of judging this, if you don't like heart rate trackers or getting complicated like that, is simply working an intensity where you can breathe through your nose for most of the session. So if you're cycling, breathing through your nose. If you're running, breathing through your nose. Maybe not if you're swimming, but just taking it easy when you're swimming. But just keep it nice and low. Now, keeping it this intensity where you can breathe through the nose, it's a pretty easy judge that you're most likely targeting predominantly the aerobic energy system. And if you can't breathe through your nose, you're likely targeting, other energy systems. Still a bit of aerobic. You're never going to do it in isolation, but you're probably going to, losing a bit of the focus. Now, if you do have issues with your nose, you can just sort of stick to a pace where you can happily carry a conversation throughout, which may seem a bit slow, but it is important. You don't have to get super, super obsessive about this. I'll just say, and I know some people do stress about this a little bit, but try to aim the majority of your training around this, and it's pretty important. Now, one thing I typically don't recommend when it comes down to this extra cardio stuff is just the HIIT workouts that are super, super, super common in the training world at the moment. And I don't know, they can be okay, but in all honesty, for a thru hiker, for a hike or whatever it may be, you can do much, much better. If you really, really, really love this training and you absolutely love it and you swear by it, yeah, okay, include it. But in all honesty, when it comes down to this stuff, most of this type of training, it's not incredibly well planned out. It does target different areas of fitness, like we talked about before, which aren't specific for your hiking adventures. And these type of sessions, they do come with a big risk or unnecessarily higher risk of discomfort and even injury. And they're always doing things like burpees and squat jumps and lunge jumps and running and all of this stuff, which may be great for some people, but is not great for most. So the only time I really would recommend this training is if you absolutely do love it, and you are already ticking off the things above. So the strength training, the hiking specific conditioning, and it's something that you really do want to include. So I'll just say that. Now, the other areas that come into this, and obviously through hiker's preparation, it goes into a lot. There are some other areas that you really do need to consider when it comes down to this to get the most out of both your preparation and also your training. Now, big one is nutrition. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because this is a whole story in itself. But what you eat really can make a dramatic difference to both your performance, but also on your comfort on the trail. Now, in all honesty, people can get away with eating anything on these hikes, and people have. Some people restrict certain food groups, some people eat barely anything, some people do all weird and crazy things. But in all honesty, people can survive doing anything. We're not talking about that. We're talking about thriving. And if you want to thrive on your thru hike and in your preparation, you need to take your nutrition seriously. Now, we're not going to dive into it too much today, but I have done another podcast around this, which is titled Nutrition for Thru Hikers. So you can get into that and have a listen to that if you want. Plus, there's lots of information on my website, and then something that is very well worth getting into. The other areas, sleep. Sleep on the trail, it often gets overlooked. We get obsessed about gram counting, and we really, really sort of forget about your sleep, but really sleeping on the trail and during your training is so important for your recovery, for your performance, and just staying healthy and not getting sick. And it is something you need to put a bit of focus into. Now, a few really simple tips here is number one, don't cheap out on your sleep systems, and please test them thoroughly before you go. When it comes down to your sleep systems in particular, ultralight and always getting lighter does not mean better. Test out your stuff and make sure you are sleeping well. Because if you go to sleep on this stuff for a week, 2 weeks, multiple months, whatever it may be, any extra quality of sleep you can get, it's going to pay off so much. So don't cheap out on this stuff and figure it out. Then the second thing is like creating a bit of a chill out or wind down routine for the end of your hiking or the end of each day as you're in camp. Something just because we can get to the end of a day and we might be tired, but sometimes we're a little bit wired. So anything you can do to help your body calm down and just relax before sleep and get a bit of a deeper sleep, always going to be beneficial. So having a little stretching or journaling or reading or anything else, it just can help you chill out at the end of the day and get the body ready to sleep. And then also probably great additions, unless they stress you out even more, is just making sure you do have a face mask and some earplugs. They won't weigh much, but they do make a big difference to sleep and well worth it. Now, other areas we may consider, self-care. So we talked about mobility before, myofascial relief, stretching, all of that. And that's not just good in your training. When you're actually on the trail, doing a little bit of self-care each day goes a long way. So getting your water bottle, doing a little bit of rolling, getting your trekking pole, doing a little bit of rolling, bringing like a cork massage ball, doing a bit of rolling, or just making sure you're staying on top of your body, just treating it right and just dealing with any aches and pains before they turn into anything serious. So have that as teach yourself how to do this in your preparations. Find what works good for you and then have a little routine, daily routine or whatever it may be to use on the trail. And it's so worthwhile figuring out. And then on the mental side of things, there's so much that goes into this as well. You've probably heard the idea around thru-hiking is 90% mental and 10% physical and all of this stuff. And, I would obviously argue with this emphasis, but there's no doubt that mental strength and resilience on your hiking is going to be so important because you're going to go through so many things, no matter what your is. There's going to be weather, there's going to be issues, there's going to be gear malfunctions, there's going to be just social isolation or whatever it may be. There's so many things you're going to go through. And it's how you face these challenges, not the fact that you come across them, but how you actually face them and how you deal with them. And that's going to be the difference between completing this massive adventure and potentially having to step off the trail. It is something really worth looking into. So I'm not going to, again, go into too much detail today around this, but it is something where you should be having a look at. So there are articles, there's another podcast I've done on this, there's books out there, but looking into mental strength strategies for hikers, definitely worthwhile. So now you've probably been listening for quite a while on this podcast, and you might be going, okay, Rowan, sweet, this all sounds pretty good, but there's one problem. How am I supposed to fit this into my week? I don't have all the time in the world to train. I'm not a full-time athlete. I've got a life. I've got a job. I've got things going on. How is this going to happen? Come on, mate. Be realistic. And in all honesty, I completely understand if you're like, yep, Rowan, you're being a bit unrealistic right now and it is feeling a bit overwhelming. And sometimes it does take a little bit of art, a little bit of magic, a little bit of sort of Tetris work to fit this all into your life. And everyone's life is going a little bit different. But to give you a bit of insight into what a standard week does look like, incorporating all of this stuff for what I might train a thru-hiker, typically as a really standard template that a lot of people end up on, they might end up doing 2 45-minute strength sessions. And that's going to incorporate the strength training, the core development, also a little bit of mobility work as well. They might do 1 to 2 of those hiking specific conditioning sessions. And then that might be 30 minutes to 60 minutes or whatever it may be. And that'll go into their week. They might do 1 hike every week or every fortnight, or sometimes people only end up doing every month. And they might do 1 recovery and mobility session, a 10 to 15 minute session once a week. And then around that, just fit in, whatever walking or extra hiking they may be able to do. But as a whole, looking at doing those 4 sessions, solid sessions a week, or whatever it may be, whatever I just said, it can go a long way. It doesn't end up taking over your week. It might be even less than what you're doing now. But if you sort of string together things in the right way, you put the right focus in, it can go a long way. Now, after all of this, hopefully this has given you a bit of insight into around how you can sort of train for, your first thru-hike or train for a big thru-hike coming up. And obviously it is a massive undertaking. But hopefully this episode has given you some insight and some ideas and some structure into where to put your focus. So you can take these strategies, apply them into your training, do them consistently, and you can be really, really confident that you are doing the right things towards a safe, enjoyable, and successful through hike, wherever that may be. And I really, really, really do believe in this stuff. And, this is what I literally spend my life doing. So I know that it does work. Now, if you have listened to this episode today and you were interested in learning a little bit more about training for through hiking, or were interested in taking all this information and getting a program made for you to take you from point A all the way up to your hike to get you in the best physical and mental position for your adventure, now I do have something for you. Now, this week, I'm looking for no more than 10 hikers who are looking to get strong and pain-free so they can conquer any adventure, whatever that may be. Now, I'm specifically looking for hikers who do have a trip coming up, or they have an ache or pain they want to get on top of, which is troubling them on the trail, or they simply want to get in a better physical position for their local adventures. Now, if any of these sound like you, and you do need help with your training and you want to learn a little bit more, I would absolutely love if you could reach out to me and we can have a little bit of chat about it all. Now, you can find me, shoot me an email at rowan@summitstrength.com.au. Make sure there's a .au on there at the bottom. rowan@summitstrength.com.au, or you can find me on Instagram at summitstrength.au. Shoot me a message to either of those. We can have a chat. We can talk through it all and really just see if and how one of my programs may be a good fit for your goals and your particular situation. And we can sort of talk through things and see if it might work out. So if you were interested, flick me an email to rowan@summitstrength.com.au or flick me an Instagram message and we can go from there. So thank you very much for listening today, guys. I really do hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've gotten some value out of it. And I really do hope it sets you up to get fit for those through hiking adventures. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.